So, Pippa, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we walk into the future, can you quickly tell us a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Johannesburg, various suburbs around Joburg. And I think the thing about Joburg that is really relevant to me is that it's a very landlocked, busy city. And when you grow up there, your life revolves around things, that are not very connected to the natural world. And that kind of, I suppose, lack of access to nature was something that really, really shaped me as a small child. And it was something that I started to notice as I got older, because my parents were very good at taking us on holidays. And every year we'd go to the bush, or we'd come down to Simonstown in Cape Town. And those were times where I remember feeling, much more myself than when I was in the city.
More connected, I guess.
Yeah, more connected and more calm.
Right. And Pippa, tell us, what was your dream career when you grew up?
Yeah, I think as a little kid, I wanted to be a vet, and then I wanted to be a game ranger. And then I ended up studying journalism at Rhodes. And it was in my final year at university, when we had to make our own kind of short films, that I discovered that there was such a thing as, natural history filmmaking. And I'd grown up watching the Blue Planets and the Planet Earths. Yeah. And I guess I realized, at about 21 years old, that this was something that I could actually do with my life. And it was very exciting and very inspiring. Yeah, and I was always inspired by films. And I think I was inspired by them because they were an escape. And you could throw yourself deep into them, and you could feel your imagination growing. And I remember, reading Tolkien as a kid and reading all the Harry Potter books. And later reading writers like Barbara Kingsolver, and just absolutely loving stories, and loving the fact that you could learn all kinds of things by throwing yourself deep into a story.
And tell us, Pippa, you won obviously a number of international awards, most notably the Oscar for My Octopus Teacher. Looking back over your career, would you say there was a turning point where things could have gone different?
I think the first big turning point for me was realizing, that I wanted to be a nature filmmaker. But it's not an easy industry to get into, particularly in South Africa. And it took kind of 9 years for me to get a foot in the door. But certainly I would say, this film was a turning point, being lucky enough to become part of this project. And then for all of these magical elements to align, in order for it to become as well received as it has been, it really does feel like there's been this incredible, just magical energy pushing the film along in the world. Right from the very, very beginning.
You're speaking about magic, and obviously there are many magical moments in My Octopus Teacher as we are watching, or as we have watched the documentary. Can you maybe recall what was the most magical, or number of really magical moments that you experienced in this project?
Oh, there were a lot of magical moments. Early on in the process, when you commit yourself to something, and I think there's something very mysterious about the creative process, where when you throw yourself into it, 100%, it fully inhabits you, and it gives you an enormous amount of energy. And suddenly things that seemed completely unattainable before become effortless. And part of the process in the making of this film was, if I wanted to understand Craig, if I wanted to understand the octopus's world and the octopus's environment, I needed to spend a lot of time in the kelp forest. So I kind of made an agreement with myself that I would go into the Great African Sea Forest every single day. I remember this was a hard film to make. It was a hard film to make and a hard film to sell. And we were rejected many times by broadcasters all over the world. And we eventually got the Netflix deal. We sent through our first cut, because once you make the deal, you then have to go through 3 or 4 rounds of changes before they'll accept the final film. And the first cut we sent through was just rejected straight away. They refused to even consider it. And I remember feeling really deflated and really, really worried, like, oh, am I actually able to do this? And it was my first big project. I didn't have experience. And that, it makes you feel very insecure and very inadequate when it happens and you don't have the prior experience to draw on and sit in your own confidence. But we were very lucky that another filmmaker came on board, a very, very good editor in the UK. Her name's Jinx Godfrey, and she and I sat for probably 6 weeks on the phone every single day, and we reworked that cut. Got to a point where we were, and I remember exporting it and uploading it to Netflix so that they could watch it. And then going out to go diving with Craig and some of the other members of my team. And at the end of our dive, we looked out and there was a whale kind of swimming closer and closer and closer. And over the next hour and a half, we had these incredible dives with this little whale that was swimming in about 4 meters of water. And it was truly magical, because when you've done something and you finished something that seemed impossible, it was so daunting. I was waking up in the morning and often bursting into tears because I didn't get to stay. And then you have this incredible and completely unlikely experience with a wild animal that's kind of lets you into its world.
And Pippa, can you tell us what is driving you today?
Big part of my journey as a human being and as a storyteller has been this realization that, the natural world is under an enormous amount of pressure, many of which have been caused by human beings. And we need nature, not just because it provides us with air and water and food and shelter and all the physical things that keep us alive. And that seems to be something that we've forgotten. And in many cases, I think it's been forgotten because people don't have access to the natural world. And that's really what's driving me today, is to explore the relationship between human beings and nature, and tell stories that inspire people to ask questions about their own relationship, and tell stories that remind people that every single one of us, whether we are conscious of it or not, we have an integral relationship with the natural world, and we need it to thrive in order for us to thrive. So at the moment, I'm working with an organization called the Sea Change Project, and my Octopus teacher was made as one of under the umbrella of sea change. And our focus is the Great African Sea Forest, which is the kelp forest at the tip of Africa. And we're trying to gain as much publicity and awareness around this kelp forest as we can, because although in some ways it's doing very, very well, it's a very, very vulnerable ecosystem and a very precious ecosystem. And when we look at other parts of the world, kelp forests are very vulnerable to climate change. And in places like Tasmania and California, entire forests have disappeared over just a number of years because of disturbances within the ecosystem. And we feel like if we want to keep our kelp forest protected, and if we want to start regenerating it, because in some ways it's very healthy, as I said, in other ways, we've lost all of the big reef fish species, for example, then we need people to know that it exists, and we need people to have an emotional connection with it. And my Octopus teacher was the first step towards ensuring that.
This planet is 70% of this planet is covered by the sea. 80% of our life comes from the ocean. So what can we do to protect the ocean and to encourage more people, more future leaders to be aware of what it takes to future-proof our interaction with the ocean?
That's a great question, Nick. Thank you. I think the first thing to understand there is absolutely every single second breath that we take comes directly from the ocean. Huge amounts of the food that we eat comes from the ocean. Even if we're not eating fish directly, often the chicken or beef that we might be eating has been fed with fish that comes from the ocean. And I think the most important thing to understand is that our oceans are our biggest engine for balancing our global climate. And in a time of climate change, that's really important to understand. And that means, increase the number of marine protected areas that we have. But it's not as simple as signing a piece of paper and saying this place is protected now, because of course that needs to be enforced. It needs scientific monitoring, and it needs a lot of buy-in from the people that live in those areas. The second thing we need to understand is, because climate change has taken hold, whether we like it or not, there are things that we cannot change, things that we certainly cannot change in the short term. But what we can do is ensure that ecosystems are more resilient. And if we look at something like the Great African Sea Forest, at some point we are going to be affected by climate change. And we already saw over summer this year, we had water temperatures of around 22 degrees that lasted for nearly 2 months, which is highly unusual. Certainly not something that I've seen in my 10 years of living in Cape Town. But nature is very, very clever, and it can adapt, depending on how many problems it's dealing with at the same time. Natural systems are incredibly resilient, but if they're dealing with warming ocean temperatures, chemical pollution from city outflows, plastic pollution flowing into the ocean, plus the fact that overfishing has caused a major imbalance in the community of species that live in the kelp forest, then it becomes harder and harder for the system to keep up and adapt. One of the most important media companies on planet Earth has just implemented a pretty radical sustainability project. They plan to be net zero by 2022. And the way that they're doing that is to invest in ecosystems that are good for climate change. So they're investing in projects that protect mangroves and projects that protect grasslands and projects that protect forests. And when big companies like that start taking responsibility, it sets a very good example all over the world. I think something that we need to be very sensitive to, though, when we think about conservation and when we think about the environment, is that we live in a very unequal world, and particularly in South Africa. You know, it's easy for me to worry about climate change and worry about conservation. But we live in a country where many people are struggling to feed their kids and send them to school. And we live in a country where you speak about marine protected areas, which are, on the one hand, they are critical investments for the future of our children. You know, these are the places that are going to become reserves for future kind of fish stocks. Places where nature is protected and has opportunity to regenerate itself. But given our country's history, you know, for many South Africans, something like a marine protected area is just another place where people aren't allowed to go, you know, another place where land has been taken away from people who've been here for a long time. And I think as conservationists and environmentalists, we need to be much more sensitive and much more creative in how we approach our work.
Now, Pippa, you mentioned the challenges you had to overcome when recording, producing, and promoting My Octopus Teacher. The many times you've been rejected, the project was rejected. So what is your advice for future leaders? How should they deal with challenges in their career? What are the lessons you learned that helped you to overcome those challenges in your own career?
I think if you want to be successful, the most important thing is to surround yourself with very good people. People who you respect and people who have your back. Because when you're trying to do something new, and particularly in creative industries, you know, there's so much self-doubt that will come into your process. And when you have good mentors around you, they can help you kind of see through that forest of terror, and remind you to believe in yourself. And the other thing I'll say about that is it's very important when you take on a project to truly believe in that project and for it to be very, very important to you. Because, you know, it's that sense of meaning that's going to drive you through when you hit these inevitable hurdles.
Yeah.
And life is just full of hurdles. That's how it is.
So Pippa, since you mentioned mentorship, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your own mentor, the people in your life who mentored you and who were important to helping you get where you are today?
For sure. So, I mean, the first thing I have to say about this film is that the only reason that I could do it was that I was surrounded by filmmakers and mentors who were much more experienced than I was. And I think what happens in the early years of your career is you're just trying to get a foot in the door. And you'll spend, you know, probably most of your 20s just going from job to job to job, just, you know, trying to stay afloat, trying to pay your rent, make sure that you are employed. And I think that that can become a bit of a trap. And what was so incredible about having a mentor like Craig in my life is he kind of encouraged me to take a real risk and take a big step towards doing, you know, the career that I'd always dreamed of. But it is terrifying. It's terrifying to move away from the safety of having a job and a salary, and the idea of a path that, you know, many people have tried before you. To take that kind of risk, you know, it was the scariest thing I've ever done. But looking back now, and I had many wobbles along the way, it was the most rewarding thing I could ever have done.
When future leaders look for a mentor, from your experience, what should they be looking for? What are maybe the skills you would expect from a mentor?
You know, I think the thing about being a true leader is you need to be quite an altruistic person. Good leaders worry about other people before they worry about themselves. And good leaders are interested in the gifts and talents of the people who they work with, you know, and interested in fostering those gifts and talents. And I think it's hard to be a leader because often you have to put your own self-interests second.
And Pippa, tell us, how can our listeners reach out to you and where should they follow you?
So if you want to find out more about the Sea Change Project, you can have a look at www.seachangeproject.com. And we also have various social media channels. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and I myself am on Instagram as Pippa Ehrlich, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. I also have an IMDb profile for filmmaking.
Thank you. And last but not least, Pippa, is there one piece of advice that you would like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own life?
I think doing what you believe in and doing something that you truly believe in, you know, to the bones in your feet is very important. And then this idea of surrounding yourself with people that you trust, and knowing that because you trust those people, it's your responsibility to nurture their gifts and talents, because that's what makes a really good leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pippa, for sharing your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership and reminding us that we should all believe in what we do, and the people around us who support us are vital to our success today.